My introduction to FOSS basically came when I was studying in the US and in a university where people were building all kinds of new technologies. And when I started talking to them and asking them what kind of technologies are you building out, and I was trying to understand what are the technologies that can be brought back to India, they said we are using Linux. And even before that, my first introduction to Linux happened in this campus when the legendary Professor D.B. Phatak. So Professor Phatak is a Padma Shri. He, at least some 4 or 5 generations of IT industry experts have learned from him. So way back in 95, he was building components for the light combat aircraft, which is now called Tejas. And when I asked him what kind of technologies are you using to build the components of the light combat aircraft, he said we are doing all our wind tunnel simulations on Linux. So that's kind of when I first heard of it. I think it was version 0.98 or something like that. So then I got interested in open source. We held a number of Mumbai Linux user group meetings here in this campus, and so this campus has a lot of good Linux and open source oriented memories. And then I was invited by Red Hat to join them. This was 2004, and I worked with them till 2011. And I got accidentally kind of got into public policy because when we were working with Red Hat, Microsoft was trying to do a lot of things around getting the Indian government to use proprietary standards. And what that would mean is that 200 years down the line, we would still be using those Microsoft formats. And then, we'll completely be logged into that data formats, and we will be continuously buying Microsoft Word and other tools. So we felt this is not good for a sovereign country. We have to have open standards. And again, this campus again is connected to open standards because there was a committee that said, what are the royalty-free open standards that Indian government should use? And Professor Shivkumar from the maths department here was one of the key persons in that committee. So let me quickly give you a run through. I'm going to zip through this presentation, but I'll also leave a little bit of time aside for the future of the FOSS United policy initiatives and some time for Q&A. It's a generic talk. The idea is that I want you to go back with an idea of how you can also be part of public policy initiatives. It's a playbook that I'm trying to share here. There's nothing, there's no rocket science here, but it's all a lot of hard work. So like I said, I worked with Red Hat for about 8 years, with Google for about 1.5 years. I ended up fighting a whole bunch of battles, FOSS in public policy, FOSS in government, Microsoft's OXML proposal, open standards, software patents. That battle is still going on. And before that, I spent 15 years in tech journalism, so the early days of IT journalism in India. 93 is when I started, 95 is when the internet came in. And I'm also a governing council member of the Software Freedom Law Center, which is the premier law firm for open source, the free and open source software community. So India has got some of the best open source policies in the world. We have a policy which says that in e-government, all other things being equal, the government will prefer open source software. We have a policy on open standards. That policy clearly says that India will use only royalty-free open standards for e-government. So HTML, for example, you don't pay a royalty for using HTML. And also think about things like word processing. There have been multiple generations of word processors. And each time there is a generational change, you lose a set of data. So I may have some data in a file format called WordStar. I don't even know how many people, I see some people smiling, so some people do recognize that, which dates us basically. So all that data is gone because backward compatibility, etc. So if you think of data, government data has got maximum longevity. In fact, in India, we are still using the cadastral maps which are created by Raja Todarmal during the reign of Emperor Akbar. These are 400 years old. So just think of it, the kind of government data that is stored, if we start paying royalties on that, it'll run into billions of dollars. So this policy was a really important one. The other issue that I was involved with in Red Hat was the software patents issue. So there was a initiative to make software patentable, and what that would have meant is that, while we in the FOSS community create software that is free to distribute, free to use, free to modify, if you wanted to use a particular method and technique, so for example, one-click shopping, Amazon had a patent on it which expired. You want to use one-click shopping, or you want to do machine-to-machine knowledge transfer, you will have to pay a royalty. There was one company which had a patent on connecting to a Wi-Fi network, and they went around suing a bunch of coffee shops and said that, hey, you guys are violating my patents, and they collected some $5,000 each from a whole bunch of coffee shops around the US. So these are the kind of challenges. We have pushed back on it, and we continue to push back on it. Today, the thing is that most of the major e-government projects run on open source. If you look at Aadhaar, if you look at GST, if you look at UPI, and the phenomenal scalability of these technologies is something that's absolutely mind-boggling. And many years ago, I happened to be speaking to the CTO of the GST network. And he said, the reason we are going with open source is because we want 100% control on the technology. Today we want to swap out one database and replace it with another, or some other load balancing technology or whatever. We should have complete control over the technology. So if you look at their architecture today, it's extremely horizontally scalable, commodity hardware, open source. And they said money is not a problem for us. We have a budget of $300 million. If we want to spend $400 million, that's also not a problem. And the proprietary vendors are all sitting outside our door. I won't name them, but they are saying, we'll give you 80% discount. But these guys are very savvy. They said 80% discount for the first 3-4 years. After that, it'll be back to 100%. Or maybe the prices have been raised, 120%. So they said we were very clear about going with open source. So today, India is one of the best users of open source from an e-government perspective. Not the best contributor back to the community, but we'll come to that. I just want you to get a flavor of what it takes to drive public policy in India. I think it was 2006 or something like that when Microsoft said that OOXML, Office Open XML, should be the standard for e-government. And it had a lot of proprietary components which meant that while it's theoretically an open standard, it had some components which said you have to look at Word 95, etc., etc. So the challenge was that if we went with that format, then we would continuously be buying Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel, etc. And that would be a huge foreign exchange outflow. So when I say we, it was a consortium of 3 organizations, Red Hat, IBM, and it was Sun Microsystems at that time. So we, 3 of us, the public policy heads of these 3 organizations, we came together and we said, we have to fight this. And what happened is there was a conference which was called, and the Microsoft CTO came down to India, and he was literally treated like royalty. Everybody is like completely, it was a different world altogether at that time. Microsoft was extremely dominant, and everybody was listening to them. There were no questions that we were allowed to ask in that forum. So we realized that the bureaucrats were very much, in tune with Microsoft. So the only way we could kind of push back on that was we started getting media articles. And, it took almost 6 months to get one journalist to write an article about it. And it hit the front page of Economic Times. And, we didn't know this, but what happened is that the journalist also went to Narayan Murthy of Infosys, and Narayan Murthy said multiple standards are okay. And we were saying there should be only one single standard for a purpose. You can't say, I can drive on the right side of the road as well as the left side of the road. So you can't, then there is no compatibility. So basically, this journalist said Red Hat, IBM, and Sun are going up against Narayan Murthy, and we were completely horrified. My God, I got calls from my boss saying, what the hell is this? What are you up to? Of course, it's completely out of our control. But the good thing is that it put it on the front page. it escalated the issue, and then the other media guys started getting interested. And then the bureaucrats started getting a little wary because they don't want a bad name. So I remember once when I went to a bureaucrat's office, that lady had a cutting of that Economic Times article, and she said, "What are your concerns? If we address this, can you make sure that these kind of articles don't come in the paper?" So then, what we did is we pushed for the Bureau of Indian Standards to form a committee, and it had 1/3 representation from government, from industry and academia. And we it was an intense battle, but we convinced IIT Bombay, we convinced, the other members of the committee to say that we should not go with Microsoft OOXML. And so a lot of standards, we think that, it's an extremely boring topic, but standards are intensely political, So my friend who is part of some standards committee says that standards are 80% politics and 20% technology. Another friend of mine who's an IP lawyer said, the golden rule of standards is that he who sets the standards gets the gold. So the thing is, in India, if we want to really be a technology superpower, we have to start setting the standards on the global stage, not just, being a downloader of standards. So Microsoft won the battle at ISO, but it lost it in India. There was very little awareness of what open standards mean. We educated the media, we educated the press, and I think it was an intense 18-month kind of an effort where everything else was on the back burner. Open standards was the only thing that we did between, IBM, Sun, Red Hat. Worked with bureaucrats, policymakers, media. Politicians and bureaucrats finally kind of started coming around to our point of view. And Microsoft also made a lot of mistakes on the way. So there was one particular issue where they got a number of non-profits to send letters to the Ministry of IT. So we did a RTI and got the letters. And all of them were identical. So we said, all these, it basically hurt the credibility of Microsoft's efforts. And then there were a whole bunch of corrupt countries that supported Microsoft's OXML. What happened is, suddenly you would find that a committee was formed. And then when I looked at the formation of the committee and the members, most of them were Microsoft Gold partners. Obviously, they're going to vote for Microsoft. So I think we kept the pressure on them. And I think the good thing is today, we have a clear-cut policy on open standards. Now I'm going to do a time check. So fantastic policies on paper. As an open source FOSS evangelist, we can't ask for better policies. But like with everything else in India, the implementation of these policies can be 100x better. So I think now what we want to do is get the government to basically hold the government's feet to the fire so that we can go back to the government again and again and say, hey, why are you using this proprietary standard? Use this open standard. Why are you using proprietary software in this project? Use open source. So we want to get the government of India to move from a tactical, money-saving kind of approach to more of a strategic, long-term approach. We contribute a lot of FOSS, but we don't. We consume a lot of it, but we don't contribute back. I think we need to slowly work on that. Software patents are still a big threat to free and open source software in India. And the multinational lobby will be kind of very aggressive on this because there's billions of dollars of royalties at stake, and whether it's say 5G, 4G technology, etc., etc. So I think this is going to be a continuous running battle unless we significantly push back on it. A lot of people don't even understand, what they mean by open source. So, for example, NPCI released a press release saying that they are going to do Beam open source. And when we found out there's no open source license attached to it, etc., etc. So we pushed back on that. A little bit of what we have been doing, I'll skip this slide, but basically we are working on an open tech strategy with Takshashila Foundation. That has been released on the FOSS Telegram channel. We met with the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on software, on the Economic Advisory Council. We met the Director General of Patents, etc., on our position on software patents. And you will see more, announcements coming out on that. So many rivers to cross. I think we want to make India a global leader in the FOSS contribution. We also want to build FOSS United's credibility within the government of India. So every time there is a policy consultation, we want to be invited to the table. We want to build coalition with industry, academia, policymakers, institutions like IIT Bombay, think tanks like Takshashila, etc. The big problem that the FOSS community has had is that we have been activists, but we have not really built institutions. So, this is a term that I learned from Rahul, which is the bus factor. So there are a lot of individuals who drive certain initiatives, but if they are hit by a bus, then the initiative dies. So the idea is to kind of build capacity in the ecosystem so that more and more people understand issues like software patents, etc., so that it's not centralized with one individual. And I think this is a conversation that we've had many times. It's time to build FOSS United as an institution. Be that outlasts all the founders and the key guys there. So mostly guys. So quick lessons. I think the lesson in public policy is that it's a game of orchestration. It's a game of patience and persistence. You cannot do this alone. You have to team up with people. You have to team up with academics, institutions. And, an orchestra conductor realizes now is the time that this instrument should pipe up. So there was a time when in OXML we wanted, the media had to pipe up. There was a time when, non-profits had to be active. There's a time when industry associations had to be active. So you have to know how to kind of orchestrate that and at what time, what sound should come out of the orchestra. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. Many of us mistake government to be a one entity. Government is never one entity. There are people who are supporting our views. There are people who are opposing us. So you have to figure out who's supporting us and then, empower them. You have to figure out who's opposing you. You have to start isolating them. So, and the other thing is absolutely escalate fearlessly. On open standards, we went right up to the Prime Minister's office and, then it became, and then the PMO sent a message to the Ministry of IT. And then you can completely see a change in the language of the body language of the, the bureaucrats, etc. So, so I'm going to stop here so that, if there are questions, I can take one or two. Thanks. Yeah. I think there are many organizations that use the term open it's become a very fashionable term. So, but it's used in ways which are not entirely appropriate. So, for example, if somebody says this is open source, but then you ask them what is the license that it's released under, they say, hey, it's actually a bilateral agreement that we are doing. We'll, give it to countries with whom we have an agreement. And so that's, of course, just one example. There are many examples where the term open is used in ways that are not consistent with the ways in which we in the open source community use it. Does that?
Hey Venki, thanks for the presentation. So we've seen a lot of initiatives in Kerala, especially when it comes to FOSS. Yeah. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on maybe whether we need to focus on maybe having state policies and integrating that with national level, or how do you see that working? Yeah.
So IT is a state subject. So therefore, working with state governments is a very good idea. And Kerala is, of course, an exemplar when it comes to India. So our idea is that, we want to work with both the central government because there are many large IT projects which are driven through the central government, but there are also, many state level policies, etc., that we could influence. So we are talking to Tamil Nadu and a few other state governments, and I think our idea now is that let's create playbooks, let's empower the local communities in these states to take those playbooks. If they need our help, then let them come back to us. But if they want to take the entire credit, let them do that. So the idea is that identify states where there is enthusiasm, there is support for FOSS from the IT minister, the IT secretary, and some key decision makers, and then see how we can work with them to support them in their initiatives. Because I think the benefits are enormous. There are huge benefits in terms of technology independence, vendor independence, digital sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we need to really, in the next year or so, we hope to be a little more aggressive in terms of working with state governments and the central government. Yeah.
Yeah, so my question is, more to do around some of the new procurement guidelines, which the government has, over the last decade, they've been going very strong on doing things like mandating procurement through centralized systems like GEM.
Yes.
Okay, and I feel that's probably a channel where open source software in general is heavily underrepresented, because you don't have anyone who can really go in and say, hey, I am listing an open source software over there, because a lot of the conditions around being a GEM vendor, have to do with ownership, with your corporate structure and all of that. So what do you think it makes sense for you guys to focus on having the government bring in maybe either exceptions or a separate licensing or a registration policy to allow for people who want to provide services based off open source software to get onto platforms like GEM?
Yeah.
Because all governments now have clear mandates saying that so much of your procurement has to happen through GEM, and if only proprietary vendors are sitting over there, that automatically means that open source is cut out.
I think that's a great suggestion, because I think these are the kind of interventions where a small change in the policies can make a big impact. So I think one suggestion we could make to the GEM folks is that have a separate category for open source, because there is also push from the Ministry of IT saying that we want to procure more open source services. So this could become a vehicle for them for procuring open source.
So one of the tricks that a lot of people use in GEM is you have the concept of a brand.
Yeah.
Okay, and many times, especially for smaller, for government departments, for smaller orders, they are actually allowed to completely bypass the tendering route and directly procure through GEM, as long as it is for a brand and there are multiple suppliers for that brand. So maybe probably taking up popular open source platforms, getting them registered as brands, and then allowing small and medium consulting companies, service companies to say, okay, we provide, for example, Moodle.
I think that's a great idea.
Get Moodle registered as a brand. And say, okay, there are hundreds of Moodle consulting companies in India. Why can't they now be providing services for any government college that is looking for an LMS, and they procure through GEM?
I think we'll work on that. We had some discussions on it, but I think you seem to know the insides of that. So
I've survived through a recent GEM registration for our startup, so I understand how painful it is, and I know for a fact, after having been through that an open source community group will probably not have either the patience or the ability to complete that process, which means they are definitely underrepresented.
I think we are out of time. Okay. Thanks for the
suggestion.
So,
big round of applause for Venkatesh.